All right. With that, I think we can start. So after a small break, we're back with our international series, and our guest today is Joe Slowik. Currently, Joe leads intelligence and detection operations at Gigamon. He has over 10 years experience of threat detection, incident response, and threat hunting operations in the U.S. government and commercial sector. And as all our guests, Joe is also ally and supporter of Ukraine. Joe, thanks a lot for finding the time to speak with us, and welcome to the podcast.
No, thank you. It was a pleasure joining.
You have experience in extremely kind of wide spectrum of cybersecurity, from threat intelligence and threat hunting to incident response, offensive security, now applied network security. Could you tell us a little bit more about your past, kind of how it evolved through so many different areas?
Sure, and it's really just been having opportunities come up at random times. So I started my cyber journey in the U.S. Navy over 10 years ago now, almost 15 years ago now. And through some opportunities there, learned a lot about offensive security and similar items. And when I transitioned out of the military into the U.S. Department of Energy, I ended up finding myself in incident response, which was something I'd never really done before. So it's like, oh, okay, so we'll do this for a little bit. And in the course of doing that work at Los Alamos National Laboratory, I started to understand how threat intelligence could really support incident response and security operations. So I started doing a little bit of work in that regard, and then transitioned to doing that full time for Dragos for several years. And did that with Dragos and then with Domain Tools for a bit. And while doing threat intelligence, I became a little frustrated with how does threat intelligence actually translate to outcomes? How do we make it useful? And so that's why I ended up going to Gigamon, where now I lead a intelligence-driven detection engineering team, where we take intelligence research and apply that to creating network-based detections. So it's really been just building off each previous role in some way and just kind of shifting with where my security experience has taken me over the years.
Got it. It looks like you're one of those people who got into security through the military. So it always has. I think these people always have like special attitude to security compared to everyone else. So that's very interesting. And do you think an expert, like modern expert, I guess, in cybersecurity, that's experienced, and like which one would be more valuable? And this is a little bit controversial question. Do you think it's more of a generalist person who has very wide kind of coverage of different areas, or do you think it's better to specialize in some area but go very deep?
I think it very much depends on what it is you're trying to accomplish within security. I think if you're trying to solve wider problems, having more of a generalist background with a bit of experience in a lot of different disciplines could be very helpful, which kind of aligns with my own background. But if you really want to be a subject matter expert, like, for example, really complex reverse engineering items are completely over my head. And I really appreciate the people who can do that. I realize that I cannot. And we need those specialists as well. I think the main thing is just from either side, from both the specialist and the generalist perspective, is recognizing what it is that you bring to a problem set and looking for who are those people, who are those experts that can help in supplementing different skill sets in order to really come up with a complete view of security issues.
Got it. And throughout all the fields that kind of you managed to go through throughout your career, which ones are more exciting to you? Which is the most interesting?
They've all been interesting to a certain extent. I really like what I'm doing now because I can take intelligence research and apply it almost immediately to customer environments, which is a very gratifying feeling. But I also really enjoyed my time doing critical infrastructure work, both in the U.S. government as well as when I was within Dragos, because that also had the impact of defending or working with really sensitive, really important networks that have a significant impact on a number of people.
Thanks a lot for sharing a little bit of these kind of your personal opinions and also story. So let's talk about critical infrastructure.
I have like 3 questions already.
Already?
Lined up in my head.
Are they about critical infrastructure?
Oh, yeah.
I mean, go ahead, if that makes sense.
Joe, first of all, thank you for coming and sharing your fantastic expertise, because that's a trajectory that impresses. And the first question I wanted to ask you is, while you were in the Navy, did you observe somehow as an object of those activities, or as an agent that performed those activities, the program of personnel retention, is it somehow systemic, right? So what could you share to Ukrainian colleagues in the public sector who are striving to retain talented personnel and make them stay for a little bit longer in the government organizations?
Right. And that's an excellent question, because it's a problem in the US, it's a problem in Europe, it's a problem almost everywhere, competing between the private sector, commercial security organizations, and government work. And I think it's a combination of 2 factors. The first is emphasizing mission, that you might not have the greatest compensation per se, but you will have the opportunity to really make a substantial difference in the overall security landscape, something that you might not get in most, not all, but certainly most private sector organizations. And then related to that mission aspect is also, depending upon what aspect of public service you're working in, is also exposure to information, tools, techniques, and capabilities that wouldn't otherwise be available to others, whether that's something, and I think we'll talk about this in a little bit, like disrupting In Destroyer 2 as it was unfolding, is something that, yes, there are a couple of private sector organizations involved in that, but certainly the Ukrainian government organizations were heavily involved and had unique visibility into those actions. And that's just not something that you typically get in most private sector areas. So it's really comes down to emphasizing opportunity and what you can do in order to try to keep people interested.
So basically you will be allowed and have access to doing something that you cannot do anywhere else.
Yeah, the basic way of saying is that you can do cool shit.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so the second one, our journey to the more or less organized approach to protecting our critical infrastructure was not easy and was not short, but it's somehow coming to a logical milestone. So basically, this week, I guess, this week, the president has signed a law that assigns finally a responsible agency to do that stuff, because prior to that it was quite a stochastic approach. So everyone was on their own, and there was almost no centralized coordination of that. So given your experience in focusing on protection of critical infrastructure, what would you advise to the people who will be tasked with creating that almost from scratch as an institution in the government?
Right. And I think you're referring to President Zelensky's move to concentrate authority with the Ukrainian Information Security Service.
Oh,
or no, or is this...
your awareness of our lawmaking process is admirable. Thank you very much. Yeah, exactly.
Okay, and I think that's an interesting item because it's honestly ahead of where we are in the United States, because having a central point of contact and point of authority, I think, is critical to coordinating resources and response. And while we've been trying in the United States with the creation of the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Information Security Agency, CISA. Yes. There are still pockets of responsibility, whether you're talking about legacy organizations like the FBI, the U.S. Military, but even obscure entities like the Transportation Security Agency that you're most familiar with if you go through a U.S. airport, having responsibility for pipeline security, which is very strange. And I think we could learn something from that in having a better way to coordinate resources and response by having that and buying into having a central agency responsible for these matters instead of having multiple parties involved, because it leads to confusion from a asset owner or a commercial entity perspective. It makes it hard to figure out, like, do I contact my local FBI office, my local CISA rep, or some other entity if I'm in the United States? So yeah, I think it's something that we could learn from outside of Ukraine.
Okay, fair enough. Thank you. That's it for now.
Okay.
That's
it for now.
I have actually a quick follow-up question, right? Like about the case, like two questions that Vlad asked already, right? What is the role of private sector, and how is this, collaboration between like government entities and private sector works in these areas?
Right, and that's that's an excellent question, because in most of the areas that we're talking about, a lot of critical infrastructure is in private hands. And so there's a tension between having government level response and management of what are state-centric problems, but the impact falling to privately run organizations. So how do you blend that effectively? I know this was an issue that we ran into a lot when I was with Dragos, and it's one that I talk about in my own private work with a number of entities still, of how do we balance that? And I don't really have a good answer for it, to be honest, because it's really difficult trying to ensure continued respect or continued appreciation for, hey, private businesses, private organizations can run their own affairs, with government stepping in to manage what are pretty concerning threats. For example, to use a military analogy, we don't expect a bank or a power company to defend itself against a cruise missile. That's the military's responsibility. Yet we're in a position where we kind of expect that bank or that power company to defend themselves against a state-sponsored or state-directed cyber event, which seems very strange. And where that...
Well, it doesn't. I think it doesn't. It's not that strange for Ukraine now, but for a country that's not at war, it is strange.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
okay.
I mean, certainly in cases of outright hostilities like what Ukraine is experiencing, it's pretty clear that, okay, government needs to step in with all of its resources in order to supplement and secure critical infrastructure. In the case of, say, Poland, which is close to hostilities, but certainly not actively involved just yet, or the United States, which is a little bit further removed still, it becomes less clear how much a military or other government entity should step in and take over for private sector operations of networks in order to better secure them. And I think, again, we could learn from Ukraine in some of the coordination and interplay between private and public sector entities for organizing defense. But I think it's going to be one of those issues that a lot of organizations in the private sector will push back against very hard until they find themselves in a situation where hostilities are quite active and quite damaging.
On this regard, there are also kind of some threat actors from Russia that affect other countries, for example, besides Ukraine, right? And they also threaten future attacks to other countries that kind of help Ukraine during this war. Is it? Do you think it's a real threat? Do you think they're going to expand? If not in the kinetic world, then maybe they will expand in cyber world. Well, not that they did not do any attacks before, but still, do you expect increase in activity from their side to Ukrainian allies, or do you think it's more of a just kind of information operation to scare people, just like with nuclear weapons?
Right. And I think we've seen things span the range of potential responses so far. So on the one hand, we've seen what I like to call computer network annoyance instead of computer network attack in the form of denial of service operations. Whether you were talking Killnet, which is
CNA both, yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Nice.
Whether we're talking something like Killnet or other things, denial of service, it's certainly something. It's not. I don't think we can completely ignore it. But at the end of the day, it's something that we can plan around, something that's relatively easy to defeat unless it's truly massive in scale, and we have experience with it, going all the way back to the incidents in Georgia and Estonia over 10 years ago now. Where things get a little bit more interesting, and this comes on the heels of an announcement from the Ukrainian services about a month ago about potential upcoming cyber impacts, not just in Ukraine, but also in the Baltics and Poland. And that announcement indicated potential denial of service. But then just a few weeks ago, there was a report from Microsoft about a ransomware strain they called Prestige that targeted entities in Ukraine and in Poland. That was very curious in that they had not previously tracked that entity or elements related to it, and the targeting seemed aligned with critical infrastructure or other significant entities. And that gets into a really interesting area of where we start seeing sort of deniable operations in using proxies or trying to blend in with notionally criminal entities, but still being fairly disruptive by blending in with ransomware operations in order to cause disruptive events. And that's something that I'm honestly surprised we haven't seen more of. We've certainly seen all of the wipers that have impacted Ukraine since well prior to Russia's resumption of hostilities. This was a war that's been going on since 2014. Certainly like 7 or 8 different varieties of wiper malware that have been deployed in the last 10 months or so. But looking at weaponized ransomware, similar to what we saw with NotPetya, which tried to mimic ransomware initially, but was very obviously not when subject to further analysis, I think that's a tactic that is potentially ongoing, like this Prestige example, and that we might see more of as a way for Russia or Russian-linked entities to inflict disruption without immediately dialing back to or signaling a Russian state-sponsored or state-directed presence.
But what do you think holds them back? Because obviously, Ukraine is a target of all sorts of Viper attack, all sorts of cyber effects, just because the war is already ongoing, right? So outside of Ukraine, they are still maybe restrained somehow because they do not want to apply anything that may go above the threshold of warfare and escalate somehow, right? But given their legal status and given their diplomatic relationships or the lack of thereof with the international community, isn't it already a little bit too late for them to hold this back? I think that there are more objective and more like concrete explanations for why they are not doing it or why they are doing it in a particular manner beyond their motivations, because motivations do not matter anymore. It's just my opinion. I do not have real deep insight into that, but I observe what happens and I see that almost nothing happens, and I understand that regarding Ukraine, their strategic goal right now is not terror, not coercion, is just dismantling basic foundation of our functioning as a society and the country. Right, so just striking kinetically the critical infrastructure. What could it be? It's scaring us. Look how well it works for over 8 months, but giving us new challenges and distracting us from war effort, it might really work, right? But it doesn't work with cyber, because cyber is something that you fix by rebooting a computer or reinstalling a network, right? It's not that you have to rebuild it from scratch because a cruise missile destroyed it to the ground. So I see that they don't do a lot of cyber here just because it's irrelevant. But why they are not targeting allies, I truly and sincerely do not understand. Maybe because of lack of resources, maybe because of lack of, I don't know, whatever. But there should be an explanation for that. Could you please speculate?
Sure. And I've been thinking about this for months at this point, because it certainly represents, like you said, a very interesting touch point given how far, well, I mean, how could relations fall very much further outside of just shooting at each other at this point between Russia and NATO and the US and so forth. But I think there's a lot of uncertainty on both sides, not just on the Russian side, but also on the Ukrainian ally side of what do we do if this happens? So from a Russian perspective, I can't say that, I can't speculate too much on what capabilities may exist, but I know if you do some research into activities like Berserk Bear, for example, and their campaigns going back to 2014, this is an entity linked with the FSB that has managed to successfully penetrate energy and related organizations in Germany, in other places in Western Europe, as well as the United States, for over a decade at this point. So there's substantial suspicion that, okay, Russia or Russia-linked entities at the very least have some knowledge of these networks and potentially have latent access to these environments that they could use. So I think the threat is certainly real, but I think on the other side, from a Russian perspective, there's a lot of concern about, if we do this, what's the consequence? Because even if we just look over the last year, all of the declarations that were coming out from the United States and the United Kingdom prior to Russia resuming its offensive operations in eastern and southern Ukraine, that there were very good indications of just what was expected of Russian military operations. And that sort of access is not trivial. This wasn't just some idiot in the New York Times pulling things out of their rear and saying like, oh, Russia's going to do this. Like, no, that information came from somewhere. And so from a Russia perspective, there should be, if they're smart at all, which I think they are, very valid concern of what do the Western allies have in our networks? And if we take some response, how would they retaliate short of some sort of kinetic response, but in the information arena? And I think that's a non-trivial thing that we don't talk about.
So the next thing you are going to say is that cyber deterrence actually works?
I don't know. I don't think it's cyber deterrence so much as it's cyber unfamiliarity. We're really in a new area that there's
ambiguous
no precedent.
Deterrence. Israeli call it ambiguous deterrence, right?
Right. Yeah, there's a certain degree of ambiguity.
I never thought about it. And now everything that Nekesoni said in that press conference that they
right.
Adjusted from the hindsight, it makes some sense.
Yeah, but I don't think anyone knows where anyone else's sort of red line exists at this point, and that's kind of holding everyone back at the moment from doing anything too provocative. It's one thing to DDoS the main website for a bunch of airports in the United States. Like, who cares? I can't check where the bar is when I check in earlier or whatever, so I can have a drink before my flight. Big deal. It's another thing to do something like take out air traffic control networks. And what would the response to that be? No one knows. The U.S., to its discredit, has not made it especially clear of how it would respond, let alone as part of, for example, we had the events unrelated to Russia in Albania not that long ago that were linked to Iranian state actors. And Albania was kind of tiptoeing around NATO's Article 5 as a NATO member. What would NATO do? No one knows. They haven't really heard a lot about that since. And I think it's been very unfortunate and arguably potentially destabilizing that we haven't had a more serious conversation among the Western allies of like, okay, what are our clear, like, if you do this, we will respond in this fashion. And it leaves a lot of...
That's bad for operational security. If you announce some kind of response, you will initiate a bunch of threat hunters running through government networks the next day, right?
Yeah, possibly. Yeah, but right now we're in a really weird spot that for the lack of... and unfortunately, Ukraine stands as an interesting case study, being the world's foremost victim of cyber warfare over the last 10 or so years, because it has been an active conflict area since the Revolution of Dignity, pretty much, between the invasion of the East and the annexation of Crimea. So there's always been a sense that it's like, oh, they're at war already, so it counts. there's been some operations in the Middle East between Iran and Israel that get really close to the line, whether we're talking about a steel mill in Iran that has a significant accident that's blamed on cyber, that's claimed as cyber, and no idea who could it possibly be, I wonder. But also operations targeting Israeli water infrastructure, which again, it's maybe activists in the West Bank. I'm sure that's who's conducting these operations.
Those shady bunch.
Right. That there's a lot of people sort of walking right up to the line, but no one's quite sure when to cross it or what happens after they do.
So they
With
just
this logic,
fear the escalation, and they presume that the options are already prepared by the U.S. Cyber Command or who is in charge of coordinating it, right?
I think there's a legitimate fear.
Theory.
Yeah.
Nice.
So,
Just avoiding security dilemma altogether, not jumping into the cycle of escalation.
Yep.
Might be an explanation. Yeah, thanks.
yeah, just like one additional follow-up here, like with this logic. So is it, that Russia's, threat actors can choose kind of less visible type of attacks? So basically focusing on getting intelligence and spying instead of, deploying some Vipers.
I'm sorry, you cut out.
Is it me?
Yeah, I
And
think
we just
Alex is
don't see
breaking
like
up
an effect
for
here.
everyone.
I think that what he wanted to ask is whether Russians
Isn't
are
it-
more focused on intelligence right now, which is very plausible, given the amount of diplomatic personnel
Yeah.
expelled
Can you
from
hear me, guys?
all around the world. Cyber is a nice
Right.
way to get some intelligence.
Well, this is true. I mean, we've seen this throughout the sort of broader Western alliance, but even in places like Japan, where there have been concerted moves to limit the access and number of Russian diplomatic personnel, well, I should say diplomatic personnel,
Yeah.
allowed in embassies and consulates, closing down certain consulates. The Dutch have been pretty good on this front as well. They're always fun to see what they do to stick a finger in the SVR's eye and so forth. So, yeah, it might be one of those cases where Russia has done some sort of calculus and said that, okay, the access that we have today is more valuable to us to ensure a continued flow of information than a one-off effort that would then eliminate that source of information, given the loss of other sources at this point. That's conjecture, because I don't, Russia has always done pretty well when it comes to running human sources, certainly to supplement its cyber operations, but it's certainly a plausible explanation for why they would be a little shy from using access in certain environments to do something a bit more disruptive.
Mm-hmm.
I'm always fascinated how we have more connection issues with people residing in California versus someone being in Kiev.
Yes.
I'm not sure if Russia, on that note about deterrence, I'm not sure if Russia's scared. Kind of don't
it's not
fully
it's
buy
not,
that
it's
point
not
because
fear, man. It's just pragmatic resource
practicality,
management.
though.
With very high probability, any cyber effect will lead to an investigation, and that's what they usually don't want to, because it's just a valuable asset. Why not remain there for longer, right? Chances are that after an investigation, they will still have some remaining access, but those chances are uncertain.
Well, I mean, fortunately for us, at least in the visible kind of kinetic realm, it's not that they showed a lot of kind of caution and
Pragmatism.
Yeah, and pragmatism. But anyway, sometime we'll find out.
A lot of people left. Don't forget about it. A lot of people left. A lot of skillful people left. We don't have any drop down of statistics, but people who could leave, right, and had skills, many of them left.
That's a good point. So, Joe, to sum up the critical infrastructure discussion, what do you think are the key lessons learned from Russian cyber attacks and Ukrainian cyber infrastructure so far? Because obviously, throughout the time, we get better at defending against those. Though, at least in the cyber realm, in the kinetic realm, we still need to figure some problems out. What do you think were the key lessons to this kind of progressive success, and what should be done in the future?
Sure. And in the kinetic realm, I don't think there's any organization who is well placed to handle what Ukraine has unfortunately experienced in the past several weeks in terms of the all-out war declared on especially electric infrastructure as well as water. But I think, and one of the lessons I've emphasized to asset owners in the U.S. and in Western Europe since pretty much since 2016, when the first Ukraine power incident occurred, is operational resiliency. It's important to note that while the 2015 and 2016 power events were certainly disruptive, they could have been a lot worse. And if they had taken place in, say, the United States, they would have been a lot worse because, whether you want to argue that this is how automated should things be or and so forth, but Ukrenergo was very well placed to manually restore and recover operations, even if their SCADA operations were very much disrupted and crippled for a lengthy period of time. And I think that investment in resilience is something that's been lacking elsewhere, that Ukraine has really showed a good example for and that others should be taking note of, and something that has been playing forward since, which is why we haven't seen, that and, combined with the understanding that this is an area of concern and vectoring appropriate resources and visibility so that we can have a case like in Destroyer 2, where this was an attempt, not an event, but an attempt that was disrupted through a coordination of Ukrainian authorities and commercial partners with good visibility, notably Microsoft and Esset, in order to take care of that event before it could take place, which I think is very valuable. So I guess to sum up my wandering answer there, on the first, it's not just about the cyber. We're talking about physical systems here, so making sure that physical controls and physical resiliency exist will minimize the impact of potential cyber events. And the second point is ensuring the visibility and the coordination with partners in government and in industry to enable things like the Destroyer 2 disruption event like we saw a few months ago.
Do you think?
Can I jump in with a question just to maybe put some metrics on what you just said? So for these 2 points, first one, how much do you think the sustainability of the infrastructure owes to security versus resilience?
Mm-hmm.
And second, in timely identifying and preventing in Destroyer 2 consequences from happening, how much professionalism and coordination played a role versus sheer luck?
Yeah. So on the first issue, percentages, 80%, because we can
80% security or 80% resilience?
Resilience.
Okay.
Because we start talking about complex systems like electric utilities and so forth, we're really talking about very complex system of systems. And you can severely degrade operations, visibility into those operations and other aspects of them, but it's really hard to take them out purely from a logical perspective. That's where the 2016 event, the Destroyer incident, was more interesting in that, at least based on my analysis, it seemed that there was a desire to try to cause physical damage as well as just taking systems and wiping them and so forth and opening breakers in the transmission yard. So yeah, having that physical resilience aspect and not overemphasizing the cyber bit, I think is something that gets lost in a lot of the cyber discussion, and it's a critical element. The second point, professionalism on the one hand versus luck on the other. I think if this had been 5 years ago, it would have been very much a case of luck. One of the things that I've been very critical about the Western information security industry's response to a lot of events in Ukraine is that we're really happy to take Ukrainian incidents as examples and write blogs and report on them and whatnot. Very few people have been very forthcoming with responding in kind and reaching out with more information. There are some who have been very good at doing that, though, and I think we saw that in this case with Microsoft, Esset, and other partners behind the scenes, based off of an understanding that, hey, this is an active incident and we have people who will be hurt very bad, of building those information sharing ties and professional relationships in advance so that something like an Destroyer 2 event could be disrupted. Certainly there's still a bit of luck involved. in terms of timing and in spotting things. But in this case, that luck, even if there was some degree of luck in spotting it, without that professionalism in tying into the visibility and analysis of other parties, I don't think we would have had a result like we did with that event being disrupted before it took place.
Cool.
Before the full-scale invasion, right, there was a lot of, I think the main activity of Russia was cyber operations in Ukraine and abroad. 2016 case, like you mentioned, many others, and so there was a lot of kind of debates and discussions around what is cyber war. Are we is Ukraine in the cyber war, or is it not cyber war, and so on. What were your kind of expectations and views on cyber war and definition of it? And did they change since the Russian-Ukraine war kind of escalated?
Sure. And I think it's important to put this in the context that, again, Ukraine's been at war for almost 10 years at this point. So this cyber component represented not some sort of unique, Russia will engage in this activity. No, Russia had occupied significant portions of Ukrainian territory while this was going on. And as we've seen in certain events post-occupation in certain areas, appears to have been engaging in other operations, such as compiling lists of individuals of interest to find and other actions post-occupation, which has been terrible and unconscionable. To get back to the cyber bit, I think what we've seen is a willingness since 2015 to keep a consistent degree of pressure on Ukrainian authorities and Ukrainian institutions, just short of military operations, and cyber has been a very effective part of that. There have been other aspects, like prior to hostilities, in sort of cutting off the supply of gas transiting Ukraine because of arguments around that to try to hold Ukraine at risk, but there's been balancing aspects or whatever with the rest of Europe in that case until Nord Stream came along, but that's since been taken care of in other ways. But a lot of the cyber elements, at least as I've, but a lot of the cyber elements, whether we're talking about the power incidents, NotPetya, or even some of the Telebots campaigns that Esed has reported on, have been about disrupting everyday life in Ukraine and trying to discredit Ukrainian authorities from being able to manage the country. And so I think that's a different element of cyber war. It's not like the classic case that you'll see mentioned in U.S. military circles of I'll cut the power to the lines that are feeding the missile defense battery so that the jets can then fly in without having to worry about anti-aircraft fire. That's exciting and interesting and maybe makes for a great story. Instead, I think what cyber has really exhibited its power to do is in conjunction with a non-standard military conflict as well, because it's unclear what Russia's endgame has been, whether it's dismantle Ukraine, re-annex Ukraine. I don't know, since they seem to be, unfortunately, bombing the shit out of Ukraine. So I don't know why you would do that if you wanted to ultimately take that into your own sphere of influence again. But really just that continued attempt to discredit and dismantle the Ukrainian state and its functioning over time seems to be where cyber war, for what it's worth, has gone throughout this conflict.
But there is no cyber war in Russia, in Russian mind, right? So
that we know of.
Do not.
That we know of.
No, I mean they do not doctrinally. They do not think about cyber as something separate from information warfare, right? So it's just a facet of information standoff, or how do they call it, right? So it's the coercion through information warfare. I think it was their main nexus of activity throughout these last 8 years. But when the time came to do something like affect related, I do not think they were prepared. They just thrown everything at us, and then just retreated to prepare something new. But it takes time, so I don't know.
I think early in the full-scale invasion, there were some attempts to try to combine cyber effects with traditional military operations. I think if you look at the acid rain instance that was reported on primarily by Sentinel-1, that tried to target strategic and tactical military communications by going after the why can't I think of the name of the company right now?
Viasat?
Yeah, Viasat. Thank you. Satcom terminals didn't work as completely as they wanted to, but I still think there was some disruption there, and then they screwed up, and it also ended up hitting some wind farms in Germany and some other stuff as well, which they probably didn't really want to do, but who knows. But then I also think it was interesting looking at some of the wiper activity just prior to the resumption in very active hostilities in February.
As you said, that it wasn't just mere annoyance. Cyber network annoyance is a great term. I hope you coined it first. It's a super term. I will use it from now on, because I don't know what is your perception of how much they have degraded, and inflated the term of cyber attack in the minds of Ukrainian people, because for most of us it was a mere annoyance. On the 14th and 15th of January, no one paid attention, like at all. It was just something that we got so used to as a background activity, that okay, so you are trying to convince us that we have to go to the streets and do something politically against our leaders who are not capable to protect us from the Russian cyber menace. You know what?
Well, I think
it doesn't work this way.
No, it doesn't. And I think that's an important point, and really represents the unfortunately unique status of the Ukrainian population, that it's used to this by now.
Yeah.
Which is sad for a variety of reasons, but also means that certain things like, denial of service, impacting access to automated teller machines and other sorts of items or whatever, it's like, okay, it's the Russians fucking around again. Okay, we're used to this.
For as long as Apple Pay works and Google Pay works, who cares about ATMs?
Well, but what's interesting, though, is that if you had taken that same sort of effect and done that in the United States, especially in the last couple of months or so, that would have probably caused some degree of panic. I'd be really curious how we'd respond to it.
It takes 8 years to get used to it.
I guess. Again, it's very unfortunate, but it really does mention something that within the scope of cyber effects, that you need a certain degree of surprise or complacency for these sorts of computer network annoyance effects to be anything more than just an annoyance. I could,
like China, it's a great explanation for what China does or does not, rather, right? So they do not produce effects because doctrinally they believe in decisive first strike. So all the cyber effects are held back until they decide to use them, and until then, just cyber collection. Right? So, and Russia does everything simultaneously, and 4 or 5 agencies are in charge. So, the background is quite solid.
Multiple agencies that don't like each other, that don't really coordinate well with each other, and
try to do the same thing simultaneously.
Yes,
on the same targets without any deconfliction. Best cyber adversary ever. Sorry for saying that out loud. But,
What do you think about informational the aspect of informational war here? Because Russia used to be pretty successful in it, in a way. At least Ukraine felt like a little bit falling behind, but now they're not as effective. And is there a difference between their kind of cyber and informational operations? Basically, what's your thought on Russian performance in informational war right now?
It's pretty shit, for lack of a better term, outside of people who are predisposed to believing whatever Russia would like to say. But I think that's an important point, because information operations don't happen in isolation. That instead, for an information operation to be successful or to have an impact, you need to align with or take advantage of circumstances that already exist and amplify them. So if you look at something, the case that many people like to refer to is the U.S. elections in 2016. that wasn't so much Russia driving the narrative as so much Russia amplifying an existing narrative within the United States. And I think what we've seen with the operations in Ukraine, short of some crazy people like in my own country that buy into like Putin is fighting the Satanists and the Nazis and other crazy shit, that instead it's really like, no, Ukraine has been invaded and this is terrible. So things, whether we're talking about NAFO or the messages that Zelensky will make, are speaking to an audience, that is already somewhat predisposed to agreeing with them. And so this can amplify that support. It's interesting, as we're coming up on an election here in the United States on Tuesday, actually, one of the concerns that people have had is whether support for Ukraine will be a victim if there's a change in parties controlling the U.S. Congress in this time. But if you look at general popular support, it seems like it should be fine. There's certainly some discussion among certain entities or whatever that, oh, this is on the table. But overall, it seems like there's a lot of popular, at least sympathy, if not outright support for what's happening in Ukraine. And so it becomes much more difficult for Russia to come in and try to portray the Ukrainians as being this evil, Nazified, whatever, because it's ridiculous on its face. Unless you're already sort of stupid, it doesn't make any sense, or so biased and so far down in conspiracy theories. It's hard to try to change that narrative around. And so I think that's been one of the key aspects in this sense of information operations, is that Russia's been trying to push a boulder up a hill, whereas Ukraine is, basically dragging one along on level ground or potentially even downhill a little bit with much less resistance.
And for context to maybe some of our Ukrainian listeners, these elections in the U.S. are rather important because this time both representatives and senators are elected, so the Congress can be fully reformatted, which only happens like every 6 years. But yeah, hopefully the support continues, and that's what it looks like so far. And you mentioned NAFO. What's your assessment of this kind of counter-offensive information operation?
It's a little ridiculous. I have a NAFO patch on my bag that's next to me right now. I don't want to grab it and mess up my microphone again. But, it's kind of snarky. It's kind of silly. Sometimes I wonder if it maybe takes things a little too silly in terms of the seriousness of the conflict in question and what's going on in Ukraine. Having said that, though, I think it does help build awareness and keeps this conflict active and in the minds of people, whereas if it had just been, especially in the West, reporting on CNN or Fox News or something else or whatever, I think there'd be a lot less popular attention, because our attention spans are short. Whereas NAFO, through memes and other things, really has done a good job of saying like, hey, this is still going on. Pay attention to this still, as well as showing that, hey, the Ukrainians are doing a good job. You might want to make sure that we're still helping them because they are holding up their end. As long as they can receive material support to continue those operations, they'll take care of business. So it's been, I think, a good boost, not just in terms of awareness, but also in demonstrating the efficacy of Ukrainian defenders, because so many in the United States, at least, had this mindset that it's like, oh, if Russia wanted to invade Ukraine, it'll be over in a week. Well, that was shown to be very much wrong. It has been, there's still a lot to do, unfortunately, but, I think Ukraine has done very well in responding to this and holding things together. And NAFO is trying to ensure that there's continued support from the West and making sure that Ukraine can continue this as best as possible.
What always fascinated me about things like NAFO is like we kind of call it, collectively we call it NAFO, but just the spontaneous, like it's not coordinated right from some like Ukrainian government department or something like that. It's a very spontaneous, natural occurrence of such. What that? Well,
that's another.
We'll find out.
Well, but that's an interesting point as well, because
kidding.
Yeah, but people have tried to.
Although it looks like
that.
something that they would really be capable of doing, I don't think they are so into the specifics of the like bedrock memes exploited in not exploited, but serving as the basis for this particular activity or
Phenomenon.
happening, I would say. So it's much more natural than anything else could be.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, from personal experience, although it's a little old at this point, the U.S. sucks at information operations. So to say that this is like some CIA operation,
no, please don't say that. Just the information, the structure of society of this kind just does not make room for this kind of shit.
fair.
So why Russia excels at it is like the complete opposite of why U.S. just doesn't have to.
Yep.
So you are well advanced in projecting your cultural power internationally without that stuff.
Fair.
And Russia just doesn't have that, so they have to retreat to these kind of operations. It's just my opinion from what's going on.
With everything that's going on, then what are your predictions of landscape of cyber threats in the nearest future, maybe a few years?
That's a tough one because I think if you talked to people 5 years ago, what their projection was.
It's a loaded question.
Yeah, well, I mean, it is. But like, for example, I just brought this up at a conference a few days ago. We still, if we're talking about things like cyber physical effects or cyber effects on critical infrastructure systems, our only pretty much complete success on that front is over 15 years old now, Stuxnet. And we haven't replicated, as far as we know, replicated that since.
The one that we know of.
That we know of. That's very important. Yeah. So there certainly may be other things out there, but that we know of, that remains the gold standard. And that on the one hand, that shows that like maybe adversaries haven't figured this out so well. But on the other hand, we're seeing lots of things, well, not just in the Russia-Ukraine or Russia and anyone else nexus, but like what I mentioned earlier, the sort of back and forth between Israel and Iran in terms of disruptive or annoyance effects. There's things going on there. There's the incident that happened in Albania that I think we're seeing maybe not an increase attempts to increase in complexity, but an increase in the diversity and the geographic spread of cyber operations. So if I have to think about 5 years from now, I would say that instead of this always cyber discussions always focusing on like, okay, it's the big five, Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, I guess big four, and then throw like US, Israel, and maybe the UK or whatever in there as well, just not really talked about that often, that we're going to see a lot more entities, state and non-state, involved in this space one way or another. It's already the case that a lot of your criminal ransomware operations are just as, if not better, in terms of capability, in terms of breaching networks, as a lot of your government teams right now, or at least for what passes for government-run teams. So these capabilities on their basis, thanks to things like Cobalt Strike and Mimikatz and all sorts of other widely available tools, aren't exactly difficult to get right now. Where things get interesting, though, is when you want to start taking initial access and information retrieval capability and apply it to something like, okay, now I want to start impacting critical infrastructure. Where things are unique there was a reporting from Mandiant and Dragos on something called InController or Pipe Dream, depending on which vendor you go with, because, of course, we all have to have separate names for everything. Pain in the ass. But anyway, what was interesting about that malware, though, is that while it hadn't been seen in the wild, which is very interesting for other reasons, it really showed a very deliberate development and research investment to building a tool that has the ability to interact with industrial environments, which starts getting a little scary that people have these sorts of tools available. So what do we see in 5 years? A lot more noise. As far as big headline events, I'm not sure, because you could argue that we should have seen it already, and we've seen attempts. We had the 2015 and 2016 power events in Ukraine, very disruptive, not as successful as they should, as I think they were meant to be, though, thanks to the response of the Ukrainians, and in 2016 because the Russians fucked a lot of things up. We had the 2017 Triton event in Saudi Arabia, again, kind of got screwed up, but very ambitious. So yeah, it'll be curious to see how things go from here.
It's definitely hard to predict the future. After all, just recently,
what do you think about? Sorry.
No, I was just saying that just recently, we deemed that the biggest threat to humanity is COVID. So we never know what will happen in a few years.
Well, it hasn't gone away yet.
It hasn't, but it's probably not the biggest threat, at least in some parts of the world.
Not the biggest concern, certainly in some areas of the world. You touched briefly the differences between approaches of different countries to cyber effects operations. So could you please maybe elaborate on the strategic alignment of that sort? Like, obviously, North Korea is just stealing money to be able to proceed with their nuclear problem under sanctions, right? So Iran is wreaking havoc and trying to punch above its weight and do everything just to annoy everyone around and be a player, right? Israel is just trying to keep everyone not to become too strong for them to contain, right? With the help of the allies, and namely United States. I don't know. China just collects, right? Because strategically they just want to have advantage by stealing intellectual property and counter innovating as fast as possible against everyone, namely United States and their allies, right? So what's the Russian strategy?
I don't think they know.
I do not see one. Maybe they just annoy me too much, and I cannot shape a strategy out of all that activity. But maybe from your position, it's more obvious.
I think it depends also on which part of Russia you're talking about, because we have three primary intelligence or cyber actors: FSB, SVR, and GRU. And even on the GRU side, as part of the overall Ministry of Defense, it's not just GRU, but the primary actor involved. And they each have slightly different, although at times overlapping missions. So if you're looking from the Ministry of Defense and the GRU side, I think it's very much on continued investment in military-related intelligence, but also developing and being in position to deploy disruptive capabilities. If you're talking SVR and to probably a similar extent to FSB, it's continued information gathering, as well as in the FSB's case, prepping for or being in a position to execute things like information operations and influence operations to varying degrees of success. So there's this idea of Putin's Hydra, to reference Mark Galeotti's paper of the same name, that you have these three competing and overlapping entities that, while it certainly makes for a more diverse threat, because you're not just dealing with a sort of unitary actor in this case, it also means that it undermines there being any sense of their having a unified Russian cyber strategy, because it seems like there's a little bit of everyone doing their own thing. Like you referenced earlier, sometimes actors in different organizations being on the same target, not deconflicting, and only finding out after the fact. It's like, oh, what do you know? FSB and SVR were both here at the same time. Who knew? So it's curious. And I think that's one reason why, especially from a U.S. and, to a lesser extent, NATO side, we shouldn't mirror image what we expect of other entities and other thinkers to do, because not everyone's going to have a very relatively top-down, fairly constrained control and direction over operations like you would see arguably in the U.S., where CIA, NSA, DOD, they're all responsible to the same executive authority at the end of the day, and there's rules, and people will usually follow them. So you won't see people sort of freelancing a little bit, or some of the conflicting events that we've seen in other areas.
So no strategy.
Certainly there is a strategy, but it's a confused one.
Very confused strategy.
So just Iran on steroids.
I mean, that's a good. There have been people remarking that, with how things have gone in Russia, can we see something like a Wagner or other elevate itself into a position like what the IRGC, the Iranian Republican Guard Corps, represents in Iran, as sort of a state within a state. I don't think we'll see that in Russia, because Russia's far more mature, and there's a lot more, sort of state history and legitimacy behind organizations, and that would be pretty surprising if that took place. But the idea of having different agencies, like you see between MOIS and Ministry of Intelligence and IRGC in Iran, kind of doing their own thing and not necessarily talking with one another. I think you do see some of that when it comes to GRU compared to the civilian organizations. Maybe not as extreme as in Iran, but there's a little bit of that going on.
Very nice points.
We're pretty much at time here, and this is impressive that we actually made it. Alex, I'll let you. It's pretty much
we have
impressive.
a question from audience here.
Right,
so
it's impressive that we managed the main
completely
portion within like 1 hour, because usually we don't. I think that's all thanks to Joe always speaking concise and to the point. Go ahead with the question.
So we have like a bit specific question, right? So do you agree on Mandiant recent forecast that EU will overtake US in terms of a region more attacked by ransomware? Maybe your predictions about ransomware trends.
Yeah, I mean, the EU is a bigger economy with more people than the United States just on its own. So it's reasonable to expect that. And I think there's been a lot of activity happening in Europe that gets underreported or under-recognized. So it wouldn't surprise me, how that plays out if we're not at that point already.
Not sure if that's a fair comparison, though, because it's kind of like asking like US and almost the rest of the world, But yeah. Thanks for that. So, and to the final question that we usually ask, and it's not for Joe's context, so we have another famous final question that usually asked in a different show that's done by some folks, including the director of Ukrainian fund, Come Back Alive, that helps the military. They usually ask something along the lines, what's up with them Russians? And the answer is like, Russians are fucked. And it just historically formed, and now it's kind of like a famous one. But in our podcast, we usually ask, what's your advice or some wishes to Ukrainian audience?
Keep it up. I think the world has learned a lot from the resilience and the stamina of the Ukrainian people, and I can't imagine what it's like to be, especially in points further east, but even in Kiev right now, given the expansion in Russian bombing activity. But please continue setting an example to the rest of us, and we'll try to do the best we can to support you, going forward.
Thank you so much for your time, for all the insights that you gave us, and also for your support. And we also want to remind everyone who's listening that we encourage you guys to support Ukraine as well, and donate to either the funds that you trust, or volunteers, or the ones that we'll share in the link in the description. Thank you so much, and be safe, and looking forward to the victory. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you. Слава Україні!